I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would write a post like this. But here I am, typing into the void and hoping strangers will be kinder than my own thoughts have been lately. I'm a woman in my mid-20s, and for most of my adult life, I've believed relationships were supposed to be clear. You meet someone, you feel something, you choose. Simple. Clean. This situation is none of those things. There are two men in my life, and they came into it in very different ways. The first, I'll call him A, has been my best friend for almost 8 years. We met in college, bonded over late-night conversations, shared failures, inside jokes, and that quiet kind of intimacy that builds slowly and then feels permanent. He knows my family, my worst habits, my embarrassing stories. He was there through breakups, career confusion, and the version of me that didn't yet know who she was. We never crossed the line into romance, but we hovered near it for years, pretending not to notice. The second B is new. I met him a few months ago through work. One of those accidental connections that feels unimportant at first. He was easy to talk to, confident in a way that didn't feel loud, and completely outside the world I had built with A. There was no shared history, no expectations, just curiosity, just the present moment. At first, I didn't think there was a story here at all. I thought one was my past, and the other was just a distraction. I was wrong. I need to be honest about A, because pretending he's just a friend is how I got myself into this mess. Loving him has never felt dramatic or explosive. It's been quiet, steady, woven into my daily life so deeply that I stopped noticing where friendship ended and something else began. He's the person I text when something small happens. The one who knows my tone well enough to ask if I'm okay even when I say I am. There were moments over the years when I wondered if we were circling something more. Long hugs that lasted a second too long. Late nights where the conversation softened and slowed. Where I felt the question sitting between us. Unspoken but heavy. Each time one of us would pull back. Timing was wrong. Someone else was involved. Life was complicated. We told ourselves that what we had was enough. And for a long time it was. I genuinely believed that if anything romantic were ever meant to happen between us, it would have already. That belief became my shield. It allowed me to date other people without guilt. To assume that whatever I felt for A was safe, contained, permanent in a way romance never is. What I didn't admit, even to myself, was that part of me was afraid. Afraid that choosing him would mean risking everything we already had. Afraid that if it failed, I wouldn't just lose a boyfriend, but the person who felt most like home. So I kept my feelings carefully unnamed, hoping they would either fade or stay quiet forever. They didn't. Then there's B, and everything about my feelings for him feels louder, messier, and far less controlled. I didn't expect to like him the way I do. He wasn't part of my long-term emotional landscape, and maybe that's exactly why he slipped past my defenses so easily. With him, there was no history to protect, no shared rules to follow. I could just react. Our conversations started light, work, random observations, harmless flirting. I told myself didn't mean anything. But I noticed how I looked forward to seeing his name on my phone, how I cared about his opinion in a way that surprised me. He asked questions that weren't polite or automatic. He seemed genuinely interested in who I was becoming, not just who I had been. Being around B made me feel seen in a different way. With A, I feel known. With B, I feel discovered. He doesn't know my past mistakes, and I don't have to explain old versions of myself. There's an ease in that, but also a danger. It's easy to be impressive when someone hasn't watched you fall apart yet. I haven't told B the full truth about A. He knows I have a close friend. Someone important to me, but not how central that relationship is to my emotional life. And I hate myself a little for that omission. Not because I've promised him anything, but because I can feel myself wanting something more with him while still clinging tightly to what I already have. The worst part is that these feelings don't cancel each other out. Loving A didn't stop me from wanting B. Wanting B didn't erase what I feel for A. Instead, they exist side by side, forcing me to confront a truth I've avoided for years. My heart doesn't sort itself into neat categories just because it would be more convenient if it did. The illusion shattered slowly, and then all at once. For a while, I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't cheating. I hadn't made promises. Feelings aren't actions, right? But that logic only works until you notice how carefully you're managing information, how often you're editing yourself depending on who you're with. I caught myself pausing before replying to A's messages when I was with B. I stopped mentioning B around A altogether, not because anyone asked me to, but because I knew, deep down, that if either of them truly understood the full picture, something would break. That's when it hit me. I wasn't preserving peace. I was delaying damage. The realization that I couldn't keep both of them in my life the same way felt like grief, before any loss had actually happened. No matter what I chose, I was going to hurt someone. And worse, I was going to hurt myself too. There was no version of this story where everyone walked away intact. I started asking myself questions that scared me. If A told me tomorrow that he wanted more, could I look him in the eye and not think about B? If B asked me to commit, could I honestly promise that A would always just be a friend? The answer to both was no, and that answer was the most uncomfortable truth I've had to face in years. That's when the weight set in. The understanding that this wasn't about choosing who I loved more. It was about choosing which version of my life I was willing to lose. Once I accepted that I couldn't think my way out of this alone, I started looking for anchors. I talked to a close friend first, someone who knows me well enough to call me out, but loves me enough to stay gentle. I laid it all out, expecting judgment. What I got instead was a long pause, followed by, "That sounds really lonely." That sentence broke something open in me, because she was right. I wasn't being dramatic or selfish. I was isolated inside a decision that only I could make, but one I desperately didn't want to make wrong. She asked me questions instead of giving advice. What scares you more? Losing A? Or never knowing what could happen with B? Who do you feel most like yourself around? Who do you edit yourself for? The problem was that every answer changed depending on the day. So I did what a lot of people do when their real-life conversations run out of clarity. I went online. I read posts from strangers in similar situations, scrolled through comments full of blunt truths and cruel assumptions, and still felt compelled to post my own story anonymously. I didn't name names. I didn't ask for validation. I just asked how people survive choosing between two loves when neither choice feels clean. The responses were overwhelming. Some people were kind, some were harsh. A few told me I was already doing something wrong by hesitating at all. But hidden among the noise were patterns, people urging honesty, warning about resentment, reminding me that avoiding a decision is still a decision. And for the first time, I started to realize that the right choice might not be the one that hurts the least right now, but the one I could live with long after the immediate pain faded. I started making mental lists. Even though everyone says you shouldn't reduce people to pros and cons, I wasn't trying to rank them as men. I was trying to understand myself, what I value, what I fear, what kind of future I'm actually capable of choosing. With A, the pros felt obvious and heavy. Stability, history, a deep, earned trust that you don't just find again once it's gone. He knows my flaws and still shows up. I don't have to perform around him. Silence is comfortable. There's a shared language built over years that makes life feel less sharp. Choosing him would mean choosing something real, something tested. But the cons scared me just as much. What if the comfort I love is also stagnation? What if I've mistaken safety for love because it's familiar? If we failed romantically, I wouldn't just lose a relationship. I'd lose my anchor. The idea of holidays, milestones, or bad days without him in my life felt almost unbearable. With B, the pros were electric. Possibility, curiosity, the sense that I'm stepping into a version of myself that's still unfolding. He challenges me without knowing my limits yet. There's attraction, momentum, a feeling of forward motion that makes me feel alive and brave. Choosing him would mean choosing risk, and I've always admired people who are willing to do that. But the risks are real. He hasn't seen me at my worst. There's no guarantee that the ease we have now would survive real conflict or time. And if I chose him, I'd be walking away from something rare and irreplaceable for something that might only exist because it's new. Every time I thought I was leaning one way, the weight shifted. It wasn't just about who I loved more. It was about which regret I was more afraid of carrying for the rest of my life. Just when I thought I had reached the limit of how complicated this could get, life added a variable I hadn't prepared for. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, almost casual, which somehow made it worse. A told me he was considering a job opportunity in another city. Not a definite plan, just a possibility he was seriously exploring. He mentioned it the way you mention something practical, not emotional. Better growth, new environment, a chance to reset. I nodded, asked the right questions, even encouraged him. On the outside, I was supportive. On the inside, something collapsed. I realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that I had been living as if I were a fixed point in my future, without ever earning that certainty. I had assumed his presence, counted on his proximity, built emotional habits around the idea that he would always be close. Hearing that he might leave, without me being part of that decision, made me feel suddenly replaceable, optional in a way I'd never considered. That same week, B did something small but significant. He asked me, directly, where I saw this going. Not an ultimatum, not a confession, just a question that carried intention. It forced me to confront the fact that what felt new and undefined was starting to ask for shape and commitment. The timing felt cruel. One man was unknowingly loosening his place in my life, while the other was asking me to step closer. I didn't believe in signs before this, but I couldn't ignore the way these moments lined up, pushing me toward a decision I had been carefully avoiding. For the first time, the question shifted. It was no longer just who I wanted. It was who was actually choosing me back here and now. I wish I could say the decision arrived as a moment of clarity, something clean and certain. It didn't. It came as exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones when you've been carrying the same unanswered question for too long. I realized I couldn't move forward without being honest, especially with A. Not strategic honesty, not partial truths. Real honesty with the full risk of losing him. We met for coffee, the same place we've gone to for years, and everything about it felt painfully familiar. That almost stopped me. Almost. I told him I was struggling. I told him there was someone else, and that the feelings I'd been pretending not to name with him had finally caught up to me. I didn't frame it as a confession of love or an accusation. I framed it as what it was, a breaking point. I told him I didn't know what the right answer was, only that I couldn't keep pretending everything was the same. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I wasn't prepared to hear, that he had always assumed if we were meant to be together, it would have happened naturally. That he loved me deeply, but had built his life around the idea that we were friends by choice, not by fear. The job opportunity wasn't an escape. It was him finally allowing himself to move forward. That was the moment I understood the decision had already been made, not by either of us, consciously, but by years of silence. What we had was real, but it lived in a space neither of us had ever been brave enough to step beyond. I left that conversation knowing that choosing a now wouldn't be choosing the future, it would be choosing the past. After that conversation, I sat alone for a long time, replaying everything in my head. I wasn't angry I wasn't relieved either. What I felt was a quiet, aching acceptance. We hadn't failed each other. We had simply protected something for so long that it never evolved into what it could have been. I reached out to B the next day. My hands were shaking when I asked if we could talk, which felt ridiculous considering how confident I'd been acting around him. But this conversation mattered in a different way. With A, I was closing a door that had always been half open. With B, I was stepping through one without knowing what was on the other side. I told him the truth. Not every detail, but the important parts. That I had been emotionally tangled. That I needed to decide whether I was capable of choosing something new without clinging to something old. I didn't ask him to wait. I didn't promise certainty. I told him I wanted to try fully honestly, without keeping one foot somewhere else. He listened, really listened. Then he said something simple that still echoes in my head. I don't need guarantees. I just need to know I'm not competing with a ghost. That sentence clarified everything. I couldn't build something real with B if I was still emotionally living with A. And, I couldn't keep A in my life in the same way without denying both of us the chance to grow. So I chose B. Not because he was better. Not because A mattered less. But because choosing him meant choosing a future that required presence, risk, and intention. Things I had avoided for too long. It wasn't a triumphant choice. It was a trembling one. But it was honest. The days after the decision were quieter than I expected. No dramatic fallout. No angry messages. Just space. Sudden, unfamiliar space where I used to be. That absence hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated. I chosen forward. But grief doesn't care about logic. It showed up anyway. And I didn't cut each other off completely. But the dynamic changed immediately. The effortless intimacy was gone, replaced by careful distance and politeness. Every conversation felt like walking around furniture that used to be invisible. I understood, intellectually, that this distance was necessary. Emotionally, it felt like learning how to breathe with one lung. With B, things moved cautiously at first. We didn't rush into labels or declarations. There was an unspoken agreement to build something slowly and deliberately to make sure this wasn't just momentum fueled by contrast. Still, I could feel the difference. I was more present, less divided. When I was with him, I wasn't mentally elsewhere. What surprised me most was how much responsibility I felt for my own emotions. I couldn't blame timing anymore, or ambiguity, or fear disguised as patience. I had made a choice, and now I had to live inside it fully. Even on days when the weight of what I'd let go pressed hard against my chest. Some nights I still wonder if I had chosen wrong, not because B was lacking, but because A had been so foundational. Letting go of someone who shaped you doesn't feel like closure. It feels like amputation, necessary, but brutal. And yet, underneath the grief, there was something else beginning to grow, a sense of integrity. For the first time in a long while, my actions matched my truth. That mattered more than I expected. It's taken me months to start untangling everything, to look back without flinching. I've realized that love isn't always about intensity or history. Sometimes it's about timing, availability, and the willingness to meet someone fully where they are, and let yourself be met fully in return. With A, I learned that deep love can exist without romance, that intimacy isn't always possessive, and that sometimes protecting someone means stepping aside. With B, I've learned that attraction can be more than physical or exciting. It can be grounded, patient, and rooted in choice, rather than nostalgia. The hardest lesson? That avoiding difficult decisions doesn't protect anyone. It only prolongs pain and creates emotional debt. For years I avoided facing my feelings, and the cost wasn't just stress or guilt, it was lost opportunities to live honestly, to let love grow in the right place at the right time. I've also realized that choosing someone doesn't erase the love you feel for someone else. I still care deeply about A, but the form of that care has shifted. It's no longer romantic, it's protective, grateful, respectful. I've accepted that this is its own kind of love, one that doesn't have to hurt anyone when acknowledged honestly. Most of all, I've learned to listen to myself, not just my heart, but my instincts, my fears, and my sense of what I can actually sustain emotionally. That kind of listening is terrifying because it demands courage, but it's also liberating. Love is complicated. Choices are complicated. But honesty, both with yourself and with others, is the only compass that will keep you from being lost in the mess of your own indecision. After the emotional turbulence settled enough to breathe, I realized I needed to spend some time reconnecting with myself. For years, my identity had been split between accommodating his presence and exploring the possibilities with B. In the chaos, I had forgotten who I was without reference to anyone else. I started small. Morning walks, journaling, reading books I had abandoned, and learning to enjoy my own company. It wasn't about erasing guilt or regret. It was about grounding myself in my own life, so that I could approach Bay without dragging remnants of my past and decisions along. Interestingly, this period of self-focus also reshaped my friendships and perspective on love. I realized I had been idealizing A in a way that kept me frozen, imagining a what-if life that would never exist. Meanwhile, B's Rodizotere presence became less about a novelty and more about mutual growth, what we could build together, without shadows lurking from my past. The process wasn't linear. Some days, grief for a hit like a physical weight. Other days, I felt exhilaration, imagining a future I actually had the power to shape. Slowly, I began to understand that the choice wasn't just about choosing a partner. It was about choosing a life I could commit to fully, without half measures. By the end of it, I knew that moving forward meant embracing discomfort, acknowledging loss, and welcoming uncertainty as part of the adventure. It was the only way to make my decision sustainable, authentic, and eventually, even joyful. Being with B, after making the choice, was not in a dramatic, everything is perfect now way, but in subtle, grounding ways that slowly rewired my understanding of love. I noticed the little things, how he remembered what I said last week, how he offered support without judgment, how our silences felt comfortable rather than tense. It wasn't always easy. I had to consciously check myself when memories of a crept in, or when old patterns of comparison tempted me. I had to remind myself that B wasn't a replacement for anything, and that A wasn't a failure or a loss. He was a chapter that had shaped me and prepared me for what came next. What surprised me most was how much trust it took. Trust in myself to love without hesitation. Trust in him to be consistent. And trust in the process of building something real from a foundation that wasn't as secure as years of friendship. Each day required patience, self-awareness, and courage. Through all this, I also learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing someone when it's messy, when the timing isn't flawless, and when the heart is complicated. Choosing B was never about erasing A. It was about stepping into the present with someone who chose me back fully and deliberately. This phase taught me that love can be both exhilarating and grounding, that it can be new without erasing the old, and that choosing someone is as much about being brave as it is about being honest. Months have passed since I made the choice, and I've started to look back with a clarity I didn't have before. The pain of leaving her behind hasn't vanished, but it has transformed. It's no longer a raw wound. It's a quiet hurt. It reminds me of what we shared and why it mattered. I can appreciate the friendship for what it was, without longing for what it could have been. I've also noticed how much this experience has changed me. I understand now that avoiding difficult decisions only prolongs uncertainty. I've learned to confront my fears instead of letting them dictate my life, and to accept that loss is inevitable whenever love is real. That acceptance is painful, but it's also liberating. What I've gained with B isn't a replacement for the past. It's something entirely new. A chance to grow with someone who chooses me as I choose him, with all our flaws and imperfections laid bare. The honesty we practice together feels like the kind of love I always hoped existed but never had the courage to pursue before. Most importantly, I've realized that love isn't a finite resource. Caring deeply for one person doesn't prevent you from loving someone else in a different way. The key is recognizing when to let go, when to commit, and when to be honest, not just with others, but with yourself. I still think about A, and I always will. But thinking doesn't mean longing. It means gratitude. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I've made a choice that aligns with both my heart and my future. Looking back, I see now that this experience taught me more about myself than any single relationship ever could. I learned that love isn't always about intensity or history. It's about honesty, courage, and the willingness to face difficult choices. I learned that sometimes protecting someone means stepping aside, and that stepping forward doesn't make the past meaningless. I also learned that the grief and joy can coexist. Letting go of a hurt in ways I didn't expect, but choosing B brought a sense of presence and possibility I hadn't realized I was capable of. The two experiences didn't cancel each other out, they informed each other, shaping the way I understand love, commitment, and personal growth. The hardest lesson was realizing that indecision hurts everyone involved, including yourself. Avoiding a choice doesn't preserve relationships, it prolongs uncertainty and delays growth. Facing the truth, even when it's painful, is the only way to create space for something real. Now I'm learning to live in the clarity of my choice. I carry the lessons from both relationships with me, the gratitude for what I gave me and the courage to build something new with B. Life isn't neat, love isn't simple, and choices aren't painless. But honesty, reflection, and the willingness to risk heartache are what allow love to grow authentically. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only one caught in this impossible place. If you're here, wondering how to choose when the heart is divided, remember, it's not about who you love more, it's about who you can fully love in this moment, honestly, and without holding back. And sometimes, that choice is both terrifying and transformative.